Well, welcome everyone to this round table around the subject of slavery, the transatlantic world, and the universities in the long 18th century. This is the result of a DAAD-funded workshop, which was due to take place in September 2021, but which has been postponed for obvious reasons until next year. So this workshop is designed to give a taster of what we'll be doing next September, in September 2022. Why don't we go around and introduce ourselves one by one?
Yep, so I'm John Freeman. I'm a PhD student at University of Cambridge. My research looks at some of the smaller participants in transatlantic colonialism, namely the Duchy of Courland, which I realise many people do not know about. Courland, in brief, is a small duchy, a vassal state to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which exists in modern-day Western Latvia.
Thanks, John. Alice.
My name is Alice Whitehead. I'm a PhD student here at Queen's College, Cambridge, and I'm currently working in partnership with the National Trust to look at the historical relationship between Shugborough Hall and the Atlantic world in the 18th century. So I'm investigating all the different ways in which the family were embedded in the Atlantic, looking at the kind of furniture they were buying, the kind of food they were eating, their land ownership patterns, and who they were marrying.
Thanks, Alice. Andrew.
Hello, I'm Andrew Thompson. I'm a historian of the 18th and 19th centuries, working predominantly on Britain and Germany, and I'm also based at Queen's College in Cambridge.
And I'm Gareth Atkins, a historian of religion in 18th and 19th century Britain and the wider British world. The proposed conference and the wider project that it's part of aims to get to the bottom of questions around the place of the universities in the transatlantic slave world of the long 18th century. And it has a handful of themes. One of them is the question of what actually happened in the universities. It's very easy to see them as straightforward seminaries of imperialism. And while I don't think anyone would deny that this is a culture soaked in imperialism, I think there are some interesting questions about what that might mean, not just in terms of education or ideology, but in terms of collecting, in terms of curating, and in terms of the social connections that are made at those universities. It's clear in many cases that planters cashed out their investments by sending their sons to the universities to become gentlemen. These are places where connections are made. Another of the themes which animates this project is the desire to get beyond the national silos into which the historiography has fallen. There's an American story of slavery and its eventual end. There's a British story of slavery, which has often tended to focus on abolition without looking a great deal at what happened before that. There are a growing number of European historiographies looking at slavery as well. And I think one of the great opportunities of this project is connecting some of those historiographies together, looking at the Anglo-German world of the long 18th century, but also simply allowing those historiographies to speak to one another. I think the other main strand that we're interested in discussing today and in the conference will be memory. What do we do with the past we've inherited? What do we do with the pasts we've forgotten as well? Universities have begun to think about the question of what they've inherited of slavery, but it's not yet become a connected story, and it's certainly not become a particularly international story. So this is something that we might talk about. So looking at what universities did at the time, looking at different national historiographies and thinking about memory, I think those are themes we're particularly interested in today. John, would you like to say a bit more about your work?
Courland at this period, in fact, was a colonial space itself, because you have medieval kind of crusading conquerors from Germany coming into the Baltic So you have the main power holders there are Germanic, and then you have sort of the Latvian peasantry who are subjugated underneath that. So the historiography of Courland and colonialism sort of really speaks to that. You have a German historiography side to it, which is a bit older actually. Baltic Germans start writing about Courland and colonialism in the 19th century, continuing on into until sort of the Second World War time. And then you have a sort of a Latvian historiography, which speaks quite a lot to Latvian nationalism as well. And this area, because of the sort of power relationships there, Courland was a vassal, as I said, of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So you have sometimes magazine articles coming out from Poland, Lithuania, even Belarus, connecting this sort of colonial story to these national narratives as well. Firstly, it's a good idea to sort of ground Courland in its sort of Baltic context. I've seen historiographies which kind of say you have your Iberian colonialism, then you have your Northern European colonialism with the Dutch, the English, the French, and then you have your Baltic colonialism, which, as well as Courland, sort of includes Sweden, Denmark, and Brandenburg, Prussia. Of course, the Baltic is perhaps the furthest away from the Atlantic that you can sort of get in Europe. You also have the fact that there's a narrow strip of sea between what is now Denmark and Sweden, called the Sound, which was about in the 17th century, where I look, was controlled by Denmark, and you had to pay a toll to go through it. So it's an extra sort of obstacle to getting to the Atlantic. And then you also have the obstacle of a low population. And this kind of has a knock-on effect of making Baltic colonialism, the Baltic colonial ventures, quite international, as it were. Sailors are hired from all over the place, particularly in Denmark, because that's where ships had to stop in order to pay the toll. And the investors as well are often Dutch people who are annoyed at the restrictions of the Dutch West India Company. I think Louis de Geer was a sort of 80% shareholder in the Swedish African Company. And then you have Benjamin Rauler, who was basically guiding Brandenburg's activities in Africa and in the Caribbean, also coming from the United Provinces, the Netherlands. And on the flip side of that, you have support from Baltic princes who are out to gain more prestige. In Courland itself, where I look at the colonial adventures, are extremely tied to the figure of Duke Jakob Kettler, who domestically has limited power, being a vassal. It's an area of the world where the nobility have a large amount of power and seek almost every opportunity to block any sort of ducal increase in power. For instance, the Duke finds it very difficult to raise an army, even though Courland's kind of getting invaded every 5 minutes. For a figure like Jakob Kepler, colonialism is a chance to assert himself personally in Europe and the world. And as a result of it, sort of diplomatic presence of Courland is increased in England, in the Netherlands, in France, in order to get colonial deals. So you find that the Danes have free ports in the Caribbean, notably St. Thomas, where there are limited rules on who is excluded from trade there. They're trying to get as many buyers as possible for their slaves. You have Brandenburg and also Courland trying to follow the Dutch example of offering to provide slaves for Spain. And then you have also the sort of diplomatic effort to kind of provide shipping to places like England. So for instance, in Tobago, where the Coranians end up, they come to this kind of deal with Charles II in 1664 that they will be allowed to settle in Tobago, and one of the conditions is that they send over a warship whenever England is having a war. Again, this doesn't really come to any sort of fruition because Courland don't manage to establish themselves very permanently in Tobago. In terms of the historiography, and I speak mostly from a Courland background, slavery is kind of a side note, because we don't know a lot about it in Courland. In fact, if you look at the slave trade database, which is incredible in its scope and size, you get 2 results for Courland. They're taken from sort of secondhand foreign sources in Amsterdam, or from the Cape Verde Islands, and not from sort of ducal sources. And ultimately, we have evidence of slave voyages, but we don't have a lot of evidence about whether they're successful and how many numbers that were involved. So the historiography is kind of lacking in that. In the sort of contemporary time, Latvian historians, I'm thinking particularly of Marita Jakovleva, have become a bit more critical about how successful Courland really was. Ultimately, Courland's involvement in colonialism only lasts a few decades. The first colony on Tobago is set up in 1654. It's done by 1659 because Courland gets invaded again, and Duke Jacob is taken off to be imprisoned for a couple of years. There's attempts during the 1670s and 1680s to recapture that unsuccessfully. And then the fortress in the River Gambia lasts from late 1651 until 1660, and is never really recaptured again, despite strenuous efforts. So there's sort of doubt about how influential it really was, how many Latvians were involved, given that, as I said before, the area is so low on human resources. The fact that many Latvian peasants are in this kind of servitude which is comparable to slavery as well, and also under doubt is how much trade was really going on, how much industrial output was really spearheaded by colonialism, and how successful it really was. By the end of Duke Jakub's rule, Duke Friedrich Casimir has to deal with a lot of debt. The factor involved in Courland's colonial adventures in Amsterdam, Hendrik Momber, is putting forward a lot of legal cases against Courland for unpaid salaries and unpaid investments. And then you kind of get the first admissions that perhaps Courland being involved in colonialism was regrettable rather than a celebrated thing. But I would say that hasn't really entered popular discourse. Again, you have a musical, which I don't know enough Latvian to understand, which I really want to, focusing on Tobago as this sort of brave new world sort of thing. And the echoes in sort of kind of popular culture of the colonies is small, because when you talk about colonialism in Latvia, they will immediately think of Germans colonizing Latvia, and particularly recently of Latvia being a post-colonial country because of the Soviet era. So the echoes are slight, but they are interesting and sometimes amusing. You'll have statues of sort of, particularly of Duke Jakub. There's one very interesting fountain in Ventspils, which has supposedly the masts of the first ship that arrived in Africa. And you have odd things like shopping centres and travel agents that are named after Tobago. So the influence of Courland's story is of interest as a kind of odd thing that people from the Latvian area once did. But I wouldn't say that it's in discourse very much, or kind of contemplated in a particularly in a way that it is in Britain, where there's sort of contests about how we remember colonial past and what has been influenced or paid for off the back of the slave trade.
So, John, I thought it was really interesting what you had to say about memory, and particularly about how the experience of colonialism in Latvia is very often associated with German colonialism of Latvia rather than the Latvians themselves being colonists. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit more on that question about why that is and when the tipping points matter, because I'm sort of struck by the kind of difference with say Britain, where the colonial legacy is now much more controversial, much more associated perhaps with negativity in certain parts of the press and indeed the historical profession, and on the other hand, very positive or overly positive views of colonialism in other parts of the press and the profession, as to whether there was something that might be said about when this happened, and moreover, whether it makes a difference that this is a kind of moment and a relatively short moment as opposed to a kind of longer period of time. So I'd be interested in your reflections on that.
Well, yeah, I think the difference maybe is how, I mean, maybe how relevant Atlantic colonialism is in these countries and societies. Obviously, in places like Britain, it's an ongoing thing. Because the empire is such a long-term thing, it's all around us. It brought significant amount of wealth and also a significant amount of migration from all over the world to to the UK, and therefore sort of evaluating the colonial past really, really matters, because this is sort of to do with how our society functions, and sort of huge problems of discrimination and racism, which is kind of connected to sort of the national narrative of whether we celebrate empire and all that entails. In Latvia, the effects of Courland being in Tobago and being in the River Gambia are not very pertinent. As I say, it was way less than 100 years that this stuff was going on. You don't have a sort of there isn't much migration from the Caribbean to Latvia or from Africa to Latvia. So these kind of questions don't sort of raise their heads so much. By contrast, the German colonialism, the effect of the Soviet Union of enforced migration of Russians to this area, is the hottest topic there is, because you have a very large percent of the population are Russian. Many don't speak Latvian and don't have citizenship because of that. And there's sort of security questions geopolitically about what that means for relationships with Russia. Also, when you think about the German noble population, they only really start moving out of this area kind of in First World War era, between the wars, and ultimately during the Second World War is when Latvia loses its German population. And seeing as unfortunately, not a lot of material has been written about Poland and its colonialism throughout the 20th century, and therefore a lot of the material has been written by the German nobility, and therefore this kind of literature kind of has connotations of German colonialism of Latvia as well, and whether Courland's presence in the Atlantic is connected more with German colonists of both the Baltic and the Caribbean, rather than the Latvians that exist in the Baltic today.
I was just curious about, you were saying about shopping centres and statues and things like that. That just struck me as really jarring, obviously, compared to the English context where we're tearing statues down. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about, monuments to Tobago, and sort of, do people interact with them, or is it just sort of they're there, people don't really have an opinion either way?
I think they're regarded as sort of fun, to be honest. Yeah. I sort of, as I say, the history isn't so powerful and as relevant in national discourse, and therefore in the sort of imagination of people nowadays, sort of the potential for Latvians to have been in Tobago or in Africa doing the things that the others do is quite a almost romantic notion. And these sort of monuments are kind of quite interesting sort of tourist places to go to. I mean, Ventspils, where a lot of these things are, and where a lot of the boats set out from. It's a the port town, is full of statues, and the ones sort of pertaining to colonialism are sort of part of that collection. I think also what is interesting is that there is a monument on Tobago commemorating the fact that Courlanders came to the island and set up shop there. And it's got an interesting inscription on it because, well, firstly, it says they were Latvians, which, as you might appreciate from what I said, is a contested thing. Secondly, it said it was if I remember correctly, a benevolent rule of free people, which again is rather jarring in comparison to narratives on, say, the British control of Trinidad and Tobago. It does seem that Corland's kind of era is not sort of felt so painfully as colonial control by, say, the British or the Dutch or the Spanish. And in fact, I believe there is in Latvia, the midsummer is the biggest thing out there. It's bigger than Christmas, the sort of biggest holiday. And I think there is a midsummer festival on Tobago, and Latvians from America kind of come there to celebrate midsummer.
So Alice, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about your research.
Yeah, of course. So my research focuses on the Anson family of Sugarbough Hall, which is quite a splendid country mansion in the middle of Staffordshire, surrounded by all this beautiful parkland. And the Anson family are, I think, quite unusual. Their family is strongly connected with the Royal Navy, and we know they've got connections with South Carolina in the sort of 1720s to 1750s. We're not really sure what those connections were because, unfortunately, they're notorious for their poor paperwork and their great distaste for letter writing, which means that we don't get much of an insight into sort of what they felt about their colonial land ownership, or indeed what it was even doing. Were they producing sugar? Was it timber? Were they owning enslaved people? And obviously, after a year of yet more COVID lockdowns, the archives have been off limits for quite some time. So I'm just starting to build up a bigger picture of what exactly is going on. But in the meantime, I've been working a lot on the house and looking through, huge reams of inventories and sales catalogues, looking at what the family are owning, where it's coming from, what it's made of, and whether or not we can trace it back to colonies in the Caribbean, places in China, whether or not it has roots in transatlantic slavery as well, and thinking about the different ways in which, obviously, colonial money is important to the story, but there are lots of other different sort of legacies embedded in these houses that are perhaps invisible to a modern eye because we have a very different approach to material culture and visual culture, which means that we don't often see the connections that are sometimes staring us in the face. So in that context, then, it got me thinking about Queen's as a college and as a lived-in environment for, let's face it, white elite men in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. And I was starting to think of a lot of the parallels between country houses and an Oxbridge college. And in many ways are not as different as you might expect. There's quite a rigid hierarchy within the college. There's a master or a president at the top, and in a country house you've got the master of the house, the patriarch, who earns all the money and distributes all the dowries, that kind of thing. There's also a hierarchy of servants in a country house, and that holds true for a college as well. And you've got material environments that are constantly changing. So you've got furniture that's constantly being moved, shuffled around, bought, sold, damaged, lost. Same goes for all the painting, same goes for all the clothes that people are wearing as well. And a lot of that stuff can be linked back to a context of empire and of slavery. But because a lot of those things don't survive for us today, they're quite hard for us to pinpoint and hard for us to get a much more accurate view of how transatlantic slavery and empire was lived out at Queen's College. I think one of the excuses that often gets bandied around for avoiding these discussions is, oh, well, slavery didn't happen on English soil, so how can we claim it's such an important part of our history? But when you look at the huge wealth of goods coming into the country that were produced by enslaved people in North America, in the Caribbean colonies, then you begin to appreciate that actually there's a really huge, tangible presence of slavery within the country. And that rings true for Queens. I think these are embodied histories. The 18th century in particular, the period that I look at, is very much a time in which the empire is touched, smelt, tasted, eaten, worn, and it reincarnates itself in lots of different ways. But I'm reluctant to say that Queens is part of a shared sensory experience, because there are so many unequal power dynamics. Enslaved people are at the heart of this. This is a story of global production and of maritime shipping. But, for example, there's a great story of the college chapel being renovated in 1775, and there was a huge bust-up amongst the fellows about what should be placed where. And anyway, they decided that they were going to have mahogany railings and balustrades. Now, mahogany is linked to a particularly violent, particularly brutal form of slavery in Jamaica and in the Lower Antilles, and it's also linked with devastating ecological damage, which we're still living with today in the 21st century. A chaplain in Queens would have touched those railings almost every single day, but his experience of touching that wood would have been entirely different from the enslaved man who was forced from his home in Africa across to the island of Jamaica, where he was made to fell a mahogany tree with little to no safety equipment. These objects are being touched by enslaved hands long before they ever reach English shores, but the contexts of touch are very, very different. And when we add to the mix that, students who were the sons of major planting dynasties, colonial landowners, imperial administrators, were all coming to Queens to be educated, then that sheds a very different light on how we should maybe interpret some of these objects that were once at Queens and perhaps still are buried away in an attic somewhere. We don't really know. I think, a really useful case study for this is the silverware at Queens, a lot of which was given as a gift to the college by fellow commoners. And fellow commoners were the wealthier students. They had a lot of privileges within Queens. But a lot of them don't necessarily have personal connections to the empire. They're maybe gentry, they own agricultural land in England. But they're giving things to college that they think are precious, that are financially valuable, but that they think are particularly fashionable or are going to enrich the social life of the college. So in the 18th century, Queens receives a silver coffee pot, silver sugar tongs, numerous sugar spoons, sugar sifters, sugar sieves, all embossed with the college crest and the college logo, huge number of silver tea urns, a tobacco plate, silver wine labels that are engraved with wines like Madeira, which we know is, the island of Madeira is heavily embedded in the story of transatlantic slavery. Obviously, not all of those items are connected with the Atlantic context. Tea, coming from India and China, coffee from Arabia, and Madeira was imported by the East India Company. But it's an important example of the ways in which different layers of empire intersect in daily life. The fact that Queen still holds a lot of this behind closed doors, I think, is still quite significant, because it shows that students and fellows were all embedded in this world of fashion and of taste, which we sort of take for granted now. I think we like to see college. I've read a lot of college histories over the last week, and they all try and set Queens apart as this sort of little self-contained world, but intellectually is quite outward looking. We're willing to share ideas and write letters and send them across continents. But in terms of how people were living, it's quite staid and everybody's quite sensible and quite boring. And actually, that's not really true. Life at Queen's was structured by empire. We've got students getting into trouble in the 1720s because they've skipped chapel to go down to the disreputable coffee house up the road. We've got the diary of Philip York, who was a fellow commoner in 1773, and he says that literally every single evening he slacks off work to go and drink tea with his mates. Sugar coming from the Caribbean, tea coming from Asia. All of this is coming together to produce a sensory world in which lots of different cultures, lots of different ideas, lots of different geographical areas are colliding and all being funneled through an idea of what it meant to be a genteel man. in 18th century England. But unfortunately, a lot of that means that, some of the most significant tangible links Queen's has with slavery and empire, most of it hasn't survived. It's more likely to be temporary and transient and no longer in physical existence. These were the parts of daily life that a lot of people in the 18th century just took for granted. But I don't think that means they're any less of a legacy and anything that, we should be ignoring. We should be talking about this.
That was great. Thank you, Alice. Would you mind me asking you a mildly challenging question?
Go for it.
If I were to say, as you say, that they just took it for granted, does it matter whether or not they were conscious of these things as imperial?
I think it's an interesting one, because I had a conversation with a friend about this today, and we were talking about iPhones and stuff, and we know terrible stuff happens in those factories and to those employees, but it's still so convenient to have that technology in our pocket and to use it. And I think it's quite a helpful angle on what's happening in the 18th century. Fellows are sitting down, students are sitting down and thinking through these really thorny issues. And we have abolitionists at Queen's, and we also have people who are very pro-slavery and pro-empire at Queen's. And what I think is quite interesting about the tea, coffee and sugar is that's all a part of how discussion happens. People sit down at formal and they eat food from empire, whether they're conscious of it or not, but it's fueling those debates and it's fueling a lot of the profit. And, okay, the stuff that they might not have been necessarily conscious of, in that moment. But by the 1790s, you've got sugar that's branded as not made by slaves. Yes. You've got all these consumer campaigns about, what we might think of as organic or kind of free trade, or not free trade, fair trade, sorry. And it is definitely rising to the surface in the 18th century, but it's just one of those things, it's a bit too convenient when it's, first thing in the morning and you want your cup of coffee, to sort of forget about where that's come from and, what's going into your cup and, what you're using to sweeten it. And I think, there's stuff that we're doing now that, in 100, 200 years, people go, did it never cross their minds that this is where it's coming from? Because it's just too easy to not think about it.
Alice, I was really interested in your example around mahogany and furniture. And I think that's a really interesting area to think about. And I was also struck by what you said about Shugborough and where stuff is coming from and how it's being produced. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit further on that kind of college country house comparison, about who's involved with this. Are there, supply chains? Are there kind of particular people that are buying from, and whether they are thinking about where this stuff comes from? I mean, because you mentioned just then the kind of the sugar not made by slaves. Have we got any evidence that this is something that people are starting to think about? Or is it just as you've described, essentially, this is the stuff that you need or want, and you don't think about too much about where it's come from?
It's easy to see colleges as sort of a world apart, when actually a lot of the students in them would have been growing up in those country houses that I'm studying, across the country and across the empire, as far away, as Jamaica and Barbados. And they're going to know people, and they're going to refer things back to college, and they're going to bring stuff to college with them. I've read stories of students turning up with, their favourite armchair that they couldn't bear to be without. And, that's probably got a mahogany clawfoot, or it's probably made of, chintz cotton from India. All that kind of stuff. I think it's a real melding pot. And I imagine there definitely are people who are buying stuff that, not made by slaves, and sort of maybe even bringing it to formal with them and saying, this is what we should be doing now. And it's part of that student culture, I think, of people arguing and debating and discussing. And I think I'd definitely like to do a lot more work in future in terms of where college is buying its furniture from. I want to know where that mahogany railing came from in the chapel. Is it something that they had lying around? Is it something that they bought secondhand from a country house? Because that's, that's not unfeasible, that things were being bought on a secondhand market. Or was it that, somebody's dad had a plantation over in Barbados and will get you cut rate timber? I'm not quite sure. It's quite a thorny issue, and the more you try and pick at it, it's a bit of a Gordian knot. There's lots of different threads and they're all tangled up together.
That's really interesting. And I think the other thing that struck me, what you were saying, is thinking about silver and what we do with silver. It's that time of year in September where the auditors are into the college, and one of the things the auditors have to do each year is check that all the college silver is there. And it's interesting to reflect on how we perhaps need to move from just checking that it's there to thinking about where it's come from as well.
So Andrew, why don't you talk to us a bit about what's been going on in Queen's and the some of the things that might have been emerging from that work?
Sure. So one thing that the college wanted to do at the same time, the university was starting to look at its own relationship to the legacies of the Atlantic slave trade, was to think about it from a college perspective as well. And I think that's important because if we're thinking about the University of Cambridge in the 18th century, the university itself has very little centralized power, also has very little in terms of centralized resource. And in fact, if you want to think about where these relationships are working, you probably need to think about the colleges, because most teaching is taking place within colleges, and that's where students spend most of their time. The university has a nominal function in relation to formal examinations, but colleges are important as well. So if we want to understand what's happening at a university level in 18th century Cambridge, then we need to think about colleges too. And Alice has already suggested some of the ways in which we might start to think about the embodied legacy of empire within a collegiate context. But it struck me and some others of us on the fellowship who wanted to think about this more, that we wanted to look at what we did know already, not least about the students who spent time here. And we wanted to see what we could find out by a little bit of prosopographical research. Now, prosopography has its detractors, the people who think that it's sort of just boring and very old-fashioned. But actually, I think if you look at what a cohort of people are doing, and particularly how the cohorts of people who are going through a Cambridge college change over time, that can give you a very interesting sense of what's happening within an institution. As it happens, for the University of Cambridge, this is a task that is relatively straightforward, because a couple of 19th century antiquarians, one of whom actually was associated with Queen's, put together a pretty comprehensive list of students who had been at the university. They sought to find out as much as they could about those students. In particular, they sought to find out information about where they come from. And this resource has now been digitized, so it's possible to search without having to go through all the volumes for a particular college and for particular locations. So one of the tasks that several of us did last summer was to put together a list of people who had been at Queen's, who had some connections with empire. How did we define that? Well, we looked at perhaps where they had come from, looking at places within the British Empire where they came up as being listed. We also looked at people who perhaps came from places with very strong imperial associations. So people connected, for example, in the 18th century with a port like Bristol, in the 19th century with a port like Liverpool or Glasgow would figure there. And we also were able to take advantage of some of the information that's available in UCL's excellent Legacies of Slavery database as well. And what I want to pick out here are two slightly contrasting figures who have come to our attention. These are figures who are not unknown in the historical record. We're fortunate because they are, for the nature of them, people who we know other things about in other contexts. But they're people who are associated with the college who perhaps their colonial connections, imperial connections, might not have been as foregrounded as previous work has done. So the first of these is someone called Henry Pickering, who is a son of a gentry family from Cambridgeshire. He studied at Queen's in the 1670s and then went on, as many people who weren't destined for the church did at the time, to go to the Middle Temple in London. One of the reasons he probably didn't go to the church was his family was of a Puritan background, so he probably had some disagreements with the way in which the church had been restored in 1662. But he's interesting in a couple of ways. His first wife, Philadelphia, was the daughter of George Downing, the mid-17th century diplomat, after whom Downing Street is named, and from whose family the money that founded Downing College eventually came. But his real connections with the empire come from his second marriage, which was to a Barbadian heiress, which means that he has considerable wealth from her. And it's through his father-in-law, who is an influential Barbadian planter, that he ends up being on the Common Council in Barbados. And he actually dies in Barbados itself in the early 18th century, although he's eventually buried back at the family home in Cambridgeshire. Now, I mentioned that he's someone whose imperial connections are perhaps not very well known at the moment. You'll find him in the historical record straightforwardly as someone who was a member of parliament. He sat for the Morpeth seat through his father-in-law's influence, and he was latterly an MP for Cambridgeshire, where clearly he had long-standing familial connections as well. But he's an example of someone about whom we probably ought to know a little bit more, and in terms of how he fits into the sorts of networks of empire. And I think it's interesting that those networks partly come through marriage, and they partly come through what he does and what that enables him to do. So he's someone who has political authority within the post-revolutionary context in England, but also someone who takes on imperial authority as part of the Common Council of Barbados. So I flank him up as one example of someone we've come across who probably merits further investigation. Second example is from slightly later on in the 18th century, a cleric this time called Andrew Burnaby. Burnaby was a student at Queen's in the middle of the 1750s, takes a BA and then an MA, and later on in the 1770s also acquires a Doctor of Divinity degree as well. But he has quite an unusual clerical career, because he spends the first part of that career outside of England. Burnaby is fortunate enough to travel to the American colonies in 1759 to 1760, and he subsequently publishes a book about those travels a little bit later on. Ironically, Burnaby is someone who thinks that the American colonies would never be able to come together and form a single political entity because he thinks they have too many disparate interests. And in particular, he identifies the differing interests of the southern colonies with their emphasis on the Atlantic economy and some of the different things that are happening in the northern colonies. That proves not to be the case, but the book is one that is popular. It's republished several times, and there's a new edition that's published of it in the 1790s. And Burnaby then spends some time traveling elsewhere. He serves as a chaplain in Leghorn or Livorno in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, so is very closely connected with other sorts of maritime trade there, and ends up as the vicar in Greenwich. And it's in Greenwich that actually we encounter another one of the ways in which he's an interesting imperial figure, because one of the really important figures in the history of race, and this is when I sort of bring in our kind of Anglo-German angle in the second half of the 18th century, is Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, professor at the University of Göttingen, a medic by training, but someone who is really interested in how human evolution, although he wouldn't call it that, works, about how peoples are spread out through the globe, and someone who's very often now associated with the growth of more racialized theory in the 19th century. And we find Blumenbach in his correspondence, which you can also find online, visiting London in the 1790s, probably partly because of the connections that existed between Hanover and England. And one of the people that Blumenbach goes to see is Burnaby. because he's interested in what Burnaby has to say about his experiences of travel, because one of the ways in which Blumenbach is building up his research is by talking to lots of people who travel to lots of different places. So one of the things we see here, going back to sort of some of the things that John was saying right at the start, is how we think about those histories, whether we think about histories of enlightenment, which is about progress and the advance of knowledge, and the role that universities clearly play within that as centres for the dissemination of knowledge, but also the types of knowledge that are coming about, the methods through which that's being acquired, and some of the consequences that some of that knowledge is put through later on. So that's two quite small examples, really, of particular individuals from a much larger number of individuals that we've already identified that are connected with the college and have broader sets of imperial connections. But one of the ways I hope that we're able to take some of this research forward is to start to recover some of these stories as well, and start to think about some of the ways in which the people who are involved with the college at different points in time come here, then go out into the wider world, and the way in which those connections are sustained and maintained.
Thanks, Andrew. I've got a thought on this. I mean, I think this, particularly Burnaby, raised an interesting question about the sort of pigeonholes we shove people into anachronistically. You know, you read a college history and it will tell you that most of the members of the college became clergy, or good numbers of them. Burnaby is a great example of a clergyman who was also a traveller, you know, potentially a sort of local diplomat as a chaplain in somewhere like the Mediterranean, and clearly someone who is very much plugged into scholarly networks in a period where the amateur doesn't really exist because the professional doesn't really exist either. So there's an interesting thing here about us needing to smash down some of the glass partitions that we might place around some of those people, isn't there?
Absolutely. I think categorization is really important. I mean, if you look at Burnaby in the ODNB, the Dictionary of the National Biography, he is listed as clergyman and traveller. So that is kind of both, it's a description and not really a profession in some ways, because the way we describe people, the ways we think about them, the choices we make about how we describe them is important. And I think as part of these wider discussions, the categories we use to think about people and how relevant and applicable they are to the peers we're talking about are really important for precisely some of the reasons you've just suggested, Gareth, in relation to kind of amateur versus professional and what that means. Because saying clergyman perhaps conjures up a particular impression of someone not doing very much, probably sort of sitting in a Jane Austen style way at the side of a room, perhaps in a country house, and not really contributing. But actually, there are a whole variety of ways in which some of those careers might play out.
Well, riffing off some of what Andrew's just said, I wanted to pick up on another couple of individuals who've cropped up in some of our collective researches. But for context, it's worth saying Queen's around the turn of the 18th into the 19th century was a college strongly infected, as some people would have said at the time, by evangelicalism. Its president, Isaac Milner, was a close friend of Wilberforce, who he knew from Hull and who he knew as a friend. So there's a very close connection there into abolitionist networks. So you very often read in a very straightforward way that Queen's was an abolitionist college. And indeed, I suspect it was, although I think it was probably a bit more complicated than that, as I'm going to explain. It was also a cosmopolitan and globalized college. There are hints of this. And I think one of the things we need to do, as various other people have said, is sort of open up places like Cambridge, make them look a little bit less like a dusty caricature. For instance, Milner's college was visited by a deputation, for instance, of Persian scholars who were very interested in seeing how the madrasas, as they described it, of Cambridge operated, but also seeing this version of Cambridge as part of what made Britain a modern globalized power. They were also interested in things like printing technology, and in Britain's economy. So they travel around Britain, as Niall Green has explained in a great book on this. But they come to Queen's. Likewise, you have figures like the Mari, who are sort of exhibited, I suppose, around Britain by the Church Missionary Society, partly to raise consciousness of missionary causes, but they also come as sort of as semi-equals. They come to meet a linguist in Queen's, Samuel Lee, who spends a lot of time with them, learning their language, and then produces a written dictionary. And I think what I'd want to draw from those examples is of imperialism as something quite multifaceted, quite embracing. I think we should see probably evangelical queens as largely abolition-minded, but I think we should also remember that this is not an anti-imperialist moment. It's a moment of imperial reform, where abolishing the slave trade for the people who wanted to do it is not as a whole a way of getting away from the idea of empire. It's a way of purifying empire and making it work better, and indeed of avoiding divine punishment for the sin of slavery. But if we delve a bit deeper into some of the personalities involved, we see that it gets more complicated and interesting still. One of the figures that I'm interested in is Nathaniel Gilbert. Nathaniel Gilbert was a clergyman who came to Queen's in around 1810. He was given compensation for the slaves that he and his family owned in the early 1830s. Gilbert's father, Nathaniel Gilbert, was from Antigua. The family had large holdings on Antigua. But Nathaniel Gilbert, the father, and it's confusing, they're all called Nathaniel Gilbert, was a missionary, and he was also a chaplain to the new colony of Sierra Leone, which was set up in the late 1780s and into the early 1790s as I guess a place to test out free labor, as a colony for the freed, as a colony for people, for the black freed people, sort of who were washing around the Atlantic world in the aftermath of the loss of America. This was set up as a colony for them. So he's involved in abolitionist endeavors. He's connected very much with the philanthropic world. Seemingly, he also continues to own slaves throughout this time because his son inherits them and then gets the compensation for them later on. So I think there's something really quite strange about that. I think that there are questions I want to find answers to if I can. But I think this shows really how complex this world is and how very difficult it is to say that, you know, someone was on this side of things or that side of things. You know, the idea that we divide that world into the forces of dark and the forces of light is clearly a bit problematic. And another example of that is a figure about whom we know quite a lot, Thomas Paranet Thompson. This is someone who came to Queen's, again, because of religious links. His father was a leading Methodist in Hull, known to the Milner family. Thompson never got a degree. He tried the law, he tried the Navy, he tried the army, and eventually went out, again because of these evangelical connections, to the what had now become a crown colony, Sierra Leone. The business venture, the Sierra Leone Company, didn't work, and so the evangelicals who led it, among them Wilberforce, leveraged their connections and got the crown to take it over. And lo and behold, they managed to appoint the first governor as well, and it was a protege of theirs, Thompson. But when Thompson arrived in Sierra Leone, what he found there dismayed him. He found a colony that rightly, he looked around it and saw a load of people who were unfree laborers. They weren't slaves. but they were indentured. They were under various conditions of exploitation. The company still owned a lot of the business out there and would sell commodities to the people there at inflated prices. And so Thompson turned himself into a whistleblower and was very quickly sacked, brought back to Britain and suppressed. He complains that he's not getting a hearing from government, he's not getting a hearing from Wilberforce and the Saints. But understandably, they're pushing this abolitionist project. They want Sierra Leone to work. And so people who think that Sierra Leone is not working, as Thompson did, are not people we want to hear from. Thanks very much. Thompson has various sorts of later career. He goes around bits of empire in the global world as a soldier, as a sort of a diplomat, becomes a politician back in Britain as well. There are all sorts of interesting things we can say about him. But again, there's a reminder there that this is not someone who we can straightforwardly categorize as evangelical, therefore abolitionist. Or rather, someone who might make us raise the point, well, what sort of abolitionist? Is this someone who is interested in the conditions on the ground or interested in a broader project? There are lots of tensions and cracks in that movement that various people have looked into, including Bronwyn Everill, who's in Cambridge over at Gonville and Caius College. But I think there are all sorts of interesting stories to tell once we look within those movements.
I was thinking, because we did sort of mention Hull, and being from Lincolnshire, I get a lot of their news, and they are very proud of being the abolitionist city and sort of being a city of freedom and stuff. So I was wondering, when we're looking at sort of blurred lines and kind of, what sort of abolitionist are they looking at it from a point of view of what works for a company, or are they sort of doing it from sort of humanitarian sort of angle, etc. How usable that is in sort of public discourse on the slave trade and on abolitionism, and where we're kind of reevaluating sort of our history and sort of thinking, what do we want to display? What do we want to display in a sort of bad light, or what do we want to keep hidden? How that could link into these sort of processes. And I do as well think as well about what I was talking about with memory in Latvia, and sort of having these kind of dual narratives and dual personalities of people that kind of don't necessarily fit into the narratives of, oh, well, he was emancipatory in this way to Latvians, but there was a slave trade, etc. So I was wondering how we can present these sort of blurred histories.
I think that's a really good question. I mean, the newspapers are always looking for sensation, aren't they? And Twitter is always looking for sort of binary stories, or at least Twitter makes binaries that people then fight about. I think another sort of glass partition that we need to break down is the one separating categories like philanthropy from profit. I mean, I mentioned Bronwyn Everill earlier on. Her book, Not Made by Slaves, is all about this sense that, a really central motivating factor for involvement in philanthropy was a sort of Smithian conviction that free labour was not only morally better than slave labour, but also more profitable. So the Sierra Leone Company, for instance, is a case in point. It sets up this colony. It's designed to trade slaving settlements on the coasts of West Africa, and they floated as a company. People are invited to buy shares as both an act of do-goodery, but also a way of making some money for themselves and those around them. They're going to be producing the things that are produced in slave plantations elsewhere. So timber, sugar, coffee are promised in the original prospectuses. but they're also going to be places where slaves are working for them, former slaves are working for themselves and happily and in prosperity, supposedly, and also making money for the company as well. It doesn't quite work out like that. But I think this is something that runs through a lot of their discussion is the idea of what does an ethical capitalism look like. And as Bronwyn says, it's often very hard to draw the line. Ethical capitalism often becomes capitalism. And the ethics are debated endlessly at the time. And so in a sense, it's a story that we should be telling. And it's a story that people like Bronwyn are telling, but it's an interestingly complicated one. And it often seems to me it falls, when it gets public, it can kind of fall into kind of either condemnation or exoneration, rather than the more interesting territory that I think it should be in.
I'd quite like to chip in. There's a lot of people out there who get the nuanced histories thing when it's explained to them in quite a neat way. You know, people appreciate that other people are complex and that there are lots of different motivations in their life, because that's the kind of life that they're living. They want to live a better moral principle life, but actually they've got to go and do a 9-to-5 really terrible job all day to feed their family, and they can't go out and be someone who saves the climate or someone who campaigns for world peace, because they just don't have the time or the energy, or it's not convenient. And I think what's really alienating for a lot of people is the idea that is the public discourse we've got at the moment in newspapers that there are saints and that there are sinners, and that historians are trying to categorize who's good from who's bad. That's a really unhelpful thing, because a lot of people on the ground, when you have these conversations in National Trust properties or in museums, they completely get that people are messy and that people are complicated and that they're motivated by lots of different things in their life, and that there's no such thing as good or bad. And actually that's not what historians are trying to do. So there's like a layer, I think, of like journalism and sort of media portrayal, which is really damaging. And it's not really got much at all to do with how historians are talking about history. And it's got everything to do with how that discourse is being warped.
Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this recording. I hope that's given you something of a sense of the issues that we're interested in, some of the historical directions that we want to pursue, and also our sense of wanting to talk about networked, complicated and blurry histories in relation to the legacies of the slave trade, both within a Cambridge college, but also more globally. There'll be an opportunity to see some of the other results of our research in a variety of ways, hopefully through publication of a volume associated with the conference, through exhibitions in the college itself. And we're also thinking about ways in which we might make some of these research outcomes more readily accessible on the internet as well. So thank you very much for listening.